Canada just dealt Russia a devastating blow, and it's done it by using a tactic that Russia itself has used to batter Ukraine since Putin began his special military operation. It's reviving Cold War-era weapons. These weapons will be a huge boon for Ukraine's air force, along with potentially offering ground-based utility, meaning Ukraine gets a versatile means of devastating Russian tanks and artillery. It gets worse for Putin. Canada isn't just sending a handful of these powerful weapons to Ukraine. It's sending a staggering 80,000, with each having the potential to decimate tanks, enemy artillery, and even penetrate deep into the heart of Russian ammunition storage facilities. Make no mistake, this is terrible news for Putin. So what are these Cold War-era weapons that Canada is about to send to Ukraine? Where do they come from, and how can Ukraine use them to not only boost its aerial might, but also its ground forces and even its drones? We'll answer all of those questions in this video, starting with the news of the delivery. In early September 2024, Canada's Defense Minister Bill Blair took part in a meeting of military minds at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany. This meeting was one of 8 that have taken place at the base since the beginning of the Ukraine war, with each bringing together Ukraine's Western partners to discuss strategy and defense issues. It was there that Blair made his announcement. Canada had committed to shipping 80,840 CRV-7 rocket motors along with 1,300 warheads for those rockets to Ukraine. The shipment would arrive in Poland toward the end of 2024 and into the beginning of 2025, before being moved on to Ukraine for its military to use against Russia. A generous gift for sure, but it's one that may have raised eyebrows among those who know the weapon. The CRV-7 is a powerful rocket system used by the Canadian Air Force in its CF-18 fighter jets for several decades. However, the weapon was eventually decommissioned, with Canada having previously planned to spend millions of dollars to dismantle the rockets and potentially use their parts in other weapons. Putin's vicious campaign in Ukraine put the brakes on that plan, with Canada instead realizing that Ukraine might be able to find a use for the thousands of CRV-7s it had in its stockpiles. Rather than spend money to fully decommission these weapons, why not send them to Ukraine, where they can be refurbished or stripped for parts that Ukraine could use in other weapon systems? The idea was first floated by the leader of Canada's Conservative Party, Pierre-Marcel Poilievre. He pointed out that spending millions of Canadian dollars to decommission the rockets was a waste when they could find use elsewhere. During a debate in Canada's House of Commons, he argued that it was time to update the free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine to open the door for sending over 80,000 CRV-7s. Instead of making Canadians pay millions of dollars to decommission these weapons, he said, the weapons could be given to Ukraine, who can use them in the defense of sovereignty. It appears Canada's ruling Liberal Party agreed. In the wake of Poilievre's comments, Canada sent a handful of these rocket engines to Ukraine before Blair made his full announcement. In June 2024, it confirmed that it had sent 2,000 to Putin's opponent, perhaps as part of a test run to see if Ukraine could actually make use of such an old rocket. Clearly it could, as the announcement of another 80,000 plus was made just a few short months later. The rockets are the latest in a consistent stream of military aid Canada has sent to Ukraine, with the total committed by the Great White North being about $3.3 billion at the time it confirmed the transfer. But what's the big deal, you may be thinking at this point? These are rockets that were in the process of being decommissioned. What possible use could they have in Ukraine? It's a good question, especially as it seems, on the surface at least, that Canada is just looking to get rid of an expensive problem by sending 80,000 CRV-7s to Ukraine. But the reality is much different. These rockets may be old, but they're still extremely useful in the war of attrition that Putin has forced onto Ukraine. How? We start with what the rockets themselves do. Short for Canadian Rocket Vehicle 7, the CRV-7 was introduced in the 1970s to serve as an upgrade to the 2.75-inch air-to-ground rockets the United States was using at the time. Produced by Bristol Aerospace in Manitoba, the CRV-7 was also a 2.75-inch rocket system, though it made massive upgrades on what was available at the time. Power was one of those upgrades. Bristol designed the rocket so it was capable of penetrating standard Warsaw-packed aircraft hangars, which were in heavy use by the Soviet Union at the time. If that seems unimportant, remember that Russia has relied heavily on its Soviet-era weaponry and storage facilities throughout the Ukraine war. Having a weapon that can penetrate hangars that are still in use by Russia is a massive boon for Ukraine. To this day, the CRV-7 is one of the most powerful air-to-ground rockets available. Even though Canada planned to decommission 80,000 of them before changing tack and sending them to Ukraine, several other countries still have active versions of these weapons in their arsenals. The rocket is being sold to 13 other nations, with the system comprised of the rocket motors, of which Ukraine will receive 80,000, along with launchers and warheads. Cheap along with being powerful, the CRV-7 is also extremely reliable, achieving a successful launch rate of 99%, according to Magellan Aerospace Corporation. So where did the rocket come from? It began life as an offshoot of research conducted at the Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment, or CARDI, now named DRDC Valcartier, in the 1950s. Initially, CARDI was researching how to create powerful rockets that used solid fuels as part of a general research project focused on the development of anti-ballistic missiles. Cardi began working with Bristol, with the two organizations eventually producing the Black Brant sounding rocket in the 1960s. The rocket served its purpose for about a decade. It also laid the groundwork for what would become the CRV-7. By the 1970s, Cardi and Bristol had come up with the idea of tweaking the Black Brant design by using the same engine and solid fuel to create a 2.7-inch variant that could be mounted into the Canadian CF-104. By 1973, that rocket was ready for production, weighing 14.5 pounds when empty and rising to 24.5 pounds when equipped with a warhead. The new CRV-7 had a burn time of just 2.2 seconds and was a revelation in unguided air-to-surface missiles in the 1970s. Why? We only need to compare it to the Mark 40 Mighty Mouse rockets the United States was using at the time. The CRV-7 used a higher fuel energy, lending the rocket much greater power, and had a redesigned fuselage that gave the rocket a flatter trajectory once launched. Impact was also a major plus point. The CRV-7 hit twice as hard as the Mighty Mouse once it reached its target, with that increase in power giving it the ability to penetrate the Soviet-era hangars we mentioned earlier. Add to all of that an effective range of just over 13,100 feet, and the West suddenly had an air-to-surface rocket that could be launched from higher ranges than ever before while delivering a devastating payload. There was only one problem: the C-14 engine built for the rocket. The aluminium-based fuel the engine used generated massive amounts of smoke upon firing the CRV-7. That was fine for the fighter jets for which the rocket was initially designed. However, it also limited the CRV-7's usability. Helicopters and slow-moving aircraft couldn't use the rocket because they would get caught up in the smoke it generated, limiting visibility and making them sitting ducks for aerial defenses following a CRV-7 launch. Bristol and Cardi solved this problem by producing a new engine, the C-15, that didn't use aluminium and featured a tail-mounted igniter that the CRV-7 ejected upon being fired. There was now less smoke, but that igniter had a habit of hitting the aircraft that launched the rocket, leading to the development of the head-end permanent igniter that was no longer ejected. Further tweaks led to the development of the C-17 and C-18 engines, making the CRV-7 suitable for helicopter use. That generated practically no smoke at all. Then there were the warheads. The CRV-7 can be equipped with one of 5 powerful warheads, each serving a unique purpose. The WTU-5001 weighs 10 pounds and is typically used as a training substitute. However, it features an 8-pound flat-ended soft steel rod encased in a nylon fairing, which makes it useful as a penetrating weapon when faced with armor. Next up is the general-purpose flechette. Each of these warheads contains 80 tungsten flechettes, which are essentially darts designed to shred through people that weigh 18 grams each. As well as being effective in the anti-personnel sense, these flechettes can pierce through the rolled homogeneous armor many military vehicles use to a depth of 1.5 inches. Each flechette flies individually rather than tumbling, ensuring greater accuracy when used against vehicles or infantry units. On the incendiary front, the CRV-7 can be loaded with the RA-79 Mod A1 high-explosive incendiary semi-armor-piercing warhead. This warhead is intended for use against ships, potentially making it very helpful against the remnant of Russia's Black Sea fleet, and uses the kinetic energy the CRV-7 generates to penetrate ship hulls. A delay fuse packed into the warhead causes it to ignite after it's penetrated, maximizing the damage it causes to ships by ensuring its explosive power isn't wasted on the ship's hull. That penetrative quality also makes it effective against other armored targets, such as tanks. Coming back to the anti-personnel front, the CRV-7 can also be equipped with the M151 high-explosive point-detonating warhead. Weighing 8.7 pounds without its fuse, this warhead also contains 2.3 pounds of composition B4 explosive. Said explosive detonates upon impact with a target, splitting the warhead into thousands of fragments that can cause severe shrapnel damage against infantry. Finally, there are the M257 and M278 illumination warheads. As the name implies, this warhead explodes to illuminate about a square mile of the battlefield, generating light equivalent to 1 million candles for 120 seconds. That makes it perfect for low-light operations, where Ukraine needs to see the precise positions Russian units have taken. It's these warheads that lend the CRV-7 the extreme versatility that has led to them being used as the unguided munition of choice for over a dozen Western nations, along with Canada and the United States, throughout much of the Cold War era. It's also that versatility that leads us to our next question. Exactly how is Ukraine going to use the massive stock of 80,000 CRV-7 rockets it's due to receive from Canada? Adaptability will play a huge role in the CRV-7's utility against Russia. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it won't have a huge supply of the warheads we've just discussed, as it'll receive around 1,300 of them compared to over 80,000 rockets, so it'll need to arm the majority of the CRV-7s itself, which it can do with almost any warhead weighing in the 10-pound region that it has in its stockpiles. Further adaptability comes from the fact that Ukraine is likely to be able to use the CRV-7 as more than an air-to-surface rocket. As Bulgarian military points out, the CRV-7 can be altered for use in multiple contexts. It's just as likely that Ukraine will fit the rockets into ground-based launcher systems. That's on top of Ukraine likely being able to use the rockets with its Soviet-era helicopters, like the Mi-8 and the Mi-24s, so they can fight against tanks and artillery systems on the ground. In other words, the CRV-7 gives Ukraine options. It now has rockets, albeit unguided ones, that have tremendous penetrative power, can be packed with numerous warheads, and are small enough to be launched from several aerial and ground-based platforms. That's terrifying for Russia, because it opens up the possibility that Ukraine could launch the kinds of all-encompassing rocket bombardments against its positions that Russia has used so frequently to target Ukraine's defenses. There's another reason why Canada has sent so few warheads compared to CRV-7 rocket engines. Some of Canada's existing warheads have degraded to the point where they're unusable. Though the solid propellant in these warheads can last for decades, it needs the appropriate storage conditions to do so. It appears that Canada can't guarantee that all of its warheads meet those criteria, meaning its choice to only send 1,300 warheads is less an example of it being stingy with its weapons and more of a choice made out of concern for Ukraine. Canada wants to deliver reliable weapons. It knows that most of its CRV-7 engines will either work or be usable in other ways. As for Ukraine, it has plenty of options when it comes to rearming these weapons. The country has made great strides to increase its domestic defense production industry. We see this most clearly in how it increased its production of mortar and artillery ammunition from 1 million rounds in 2023 to 2.5 million rounds in 2024, a 150% increase. And it's not just mortar and artillery that's seeing such dramatic increases. Ukraine saw its total domestic arms production, primarily led by drone manufacturing, grow by 500% during 2024. It also shows no signs of slowing down. Buoyed by the Danish model, which has seen Denmark provide Ukraine with hundreds of millions of dollars to build its own weapons rather than sending weapons directly, Ukraine's arms industry will likely grow further in 2025. That growth will be massive for its ability to use the CRV-7. With more infrastructure comes the ability for Ukraine to build its own warheads. It doesn't need any of the older and potentially less reliable warheads Canada has in its stockpiles. Ukraine will likely spend some time reverse engineering the CRV-7, with Canada's help, to figure out how to build its own variants of the warheads we've already discussed. It may also be able to rely on other European countries, perhaps Poland and Romania, to build even more warheads outside of Ukraine. There's just one more problem for Ukraine to overcome. The CRV-7 is dumb. No, we don't mean that it's a stupid weapon, rather the CRV-7 is an unguided rocket, which affects how Ukraine uses it on the battlefield. The rocket needs to be aimed. For instance, Ukraine is likely going to load at least some of its CRV-7s into its Soviet-era attack helicopters. These helicopters won't be able to fire and forget these missiles while relying on internal guidance systems to ensure they reach their targets. The choppers will have to get up close and personal. That means flying within viewable range of a target before pointing their noses at said target to ensure the CRV-7s fire in their direction. Once in the air, the rockets have extremely stable trajectories that make it very likely they'll hit home as long as they're aimed properly. However, it does mean that Ukraine's chopper pilots may need to scale a steep learning curve to use the CRV-7s, something that should be doable given the sheer volume of these rockets that Canada has sent. The rockets being unguided also creates more risk for Ukraine when it tries to use them, which brings us to another question. Is there any way for Ukraine to get around the dumb rocket challenge? Possibly. In 2006, Bristol started working on a new version of the CRV-7 called the CRV-7 PG. The PG stands for Precision Guided, and the company's work transformed the standard CR-7 into a smart munition, capable of hitting a target without being aimed. It was loaded with a seeker created by Kongsberg Defence and Aerospace, which was installed in the front of an otherwise unchanged CRV-7. That seeker uses an inertial guidance system that activates during the mid-course of the rocket's journey and allows it to home in on a target using a laser designator. In other words, the target is marked with a laser and the CRV-7 PG can hit it without a pilot or ground crew needing to aim the rocket. The PG version of the CRV-7 was put on sale in 2007, with Bristol having since developed versions that use GPS tracking and offer anti-radiation seeking capabilities. It's unknown how many, if any, of the 80,000 CRV-7s Ukraine has received from Canada are the PG versions, but it may not matter. The modifications needed to transform a CRV-7 into its PG variant are fairly minor and can be done using a kit that includes the in-flight control system and new tail fins. If Ukraine is able to secure some of these kits, or build some of its own with Canada's help, It'll make its CRV-7s even more useful, especially as anti-tank weapons. Combining the PG kit with a suitable penetrative warhead would make Ukraine's new stock of CRV-7s usable as long-range anti-tank weapons that pack a harder punch and move even faster than traditional air-to-tank weapons like the AGM-114 Hellfire. Add to that the tube-mounted variant of the CRV-7, which Bristol developed for Canadian Special Forces and could also be used in Ukraine to attack tanks from the ground, and you'll see why Putin is so terrified of this weapon. Remember that Russia has already lost 9,833 tanks and almost 20,500 armored fighting vehicles in Ukraine. Both could become targets of Ukraine's adapted CRV-7 rockets. And given that Russia was believed to only have about 7,000 more tanks in storage in September 2023, you can see the numbers game starting to play out in Ukraine's favor. Having 80,000 rockets capable of destroying tanks means that the 7,000 Russia has yet to deploy don't stand much of a chance. With the CRV-7, Ukraine has an opportunity to destroy thousands more Russian mechanized units, forcing Putin to increasingly rely on human wave assaults that cost him even more in manpower. And it gets worse. For Putin, Russia's leader might feel that some of the impact of this massive delivery of 80,000 CRV-7s will be mitigated by at least some of the rockets not working anymore. After all, many of them were built during the Cold War era. And if there's one thing Putin has discovered himself during his special military operation, it's that you can't expect all Cold War weapons to work as they did decades ago. He might be right, but any non-working CRV-7s will only create even more problems for Russia. Ukraine's massive investment into drone manufacturing means that it'll be able to strip any non-working CRV-7s down for parts to build even more of its unmanned aerial vehicles. Those drones now account for 80% of Russia's frontline personnel losses. So if Ukraine can't target tanks, artillery, and other armored weapons on the ground with CRV-7s, it can indirectly target personnel by repurposing these powerful rockets for use as part of its ever-growing drone army. And just to rub salt into the wounds, the CRV-7s aren't the only weapons Canada committed to Ukraine toward the end of 2024. It's also going to send over 970 C6 machine guns, each one being mountable on armored and off-road vehicles, along with 10,500 9mm pistols Ukraine can use to ensure its infantry has access to more small arms for ground battles. Add to this the decommissioned chassis of 29 M113 armored personnel carriers and 64 Coyote light armored vehicles, all of which Ukraine can repurpose for its own vehicles, and you have a bumper aid package of which the 80,000 CRV-7s are simply the biggest part. More Canadian help is coming in the future too, with Blair announcing a further $440 million in military aid in 2025. That money will primarily go to helping Ukraine procure larger caliber ammunition and funding its Danish model so it can build more of its own drones and munitions. Canada is intent on making Ukraine's air force, along with its ground forces, unstoppable. The delivery of over 80,000 CRV-7s helps it along its way, leaving Putin shaking in his boots at the prospect of a Ukraine that can take out more of his mechanized units than ever before. But what do you think about this bumper rocket delivery from Canada to Ukraine? Will it be a game changer in the Ukraine war? How do you think Ukraine will use its new stockpiles of CRV-7s? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Russia will go to war with Canada because of this, or click this other video instead.